In March 1974, the newly independent nation of Bangladesh experienced a severe famine, unlike anything it had encountered before. Only 2 years before, the country had survived a cataclysmic fight for liberation. But this was another nightmare. The disastrous outcome of the famine was proof that the newly liberated Bangladesh was indeed an economic basket case. But you know what? Bangladesh surprised the entire world. In just 50 years of its existence, the country has become one of the fastest growing economies on the face of the planet and a rapidly growing South Asian tiger. Bangladesh's ascent to global prominence is a tale of war, hardship, betrayal, and success. When India was partitioned in 1947, a geographical anomaly was created between the East and West in the newly established Dominion of Pakistan. Between them was 1,600 kilometers of Indian territory. You'll be surprised how they painstakingly protected the charade of being recognized as a single nation. It wasn't just a geographical factor that separated the West and the East wings. They also differed in cultural orientation. West Pakistanis saw the Eastern Muslims as second-class citizens and treated them with inferiority. They also considered Eastern Muslims as being too Bengali and impure in their application of Islam. In 1948, the government of Pakistan made a thoughtless decision that perhaps catalyzed the War of Independence in 1971. The government declared Urdu as the nation's first language, despite the fact that only 4% of the population were fluent in the language. The East was allowed to choose its own provincial language, but the problem was Bengali. The Eastern language wasn't recognized as the second national language by the Pakistani government. The government argued that Bengali was a part of the Hinduized Bengali culture, which did not measure to Pakistani tradition. So the problem wasn't having two national languages, but the fact that one language was assumed to be inferior to the other. Well, this sparked the Bengali language movement and also empowered the Eastern Awami League, which became a dominant opposition to the ruling Muslim League in the West. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who would become the father of independent Bangladesh, introduced the Six-Point Movement in the mid-60s, which called for greater autonomy in East Pakistan. This was, in fact, the beginning of a long journey to freedom for East Pakistan. Other requirements in Sheikh Mujib's Six-Point Movement included separate military or paramilitary forces, separate accounts for the foreign exchange earnings of both wings, a restriction in taxation and revenue collection by the federal center, separate bank reserves, as well as fiscal and monetary policies. These requests were outrageous to both the Western wing and Eastern politicians, who didn't subscribe to the ideology of the Awami League. The political tension between East and West Pakistan climaxed in 1970, pushing both regions into a bloody conflict. Perhaps the bitterness between East and West Pakistan could have climaxed as something other than war. But with West Pakistan's response to Cyclone Bola in 1970, which struck the East in its severity, all hopes of resolution were dashed to pieces. More than 300,000 lives were lost in what remains the deadliest tropical cyclone in human history. In the wake of the disaster, the government of Pakistan admitted it made some slips and mistakes in meeting the needs of displaced East Wing citizens. On top of that, no political leader from West Pakistan visited the East. Then again, during the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, the Pakistani government failed to assign extra units of defense to protect East Pakistan. The bitterness between the West and East Wings worsened and set the stage for an even greater catastrophe. In 1970, the Dominion of Pakistan held its general elections, but contrary to the expectations of West Pakistani politicians, the Awami League headed by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman won by a clear majority. Of course, this result wasn't accepted by the West, which increased the tension in both wings. Following the political impasse between West and East Pakistan, Bengalis in the East began attacking ethnic Biharis who supported West Pakistan. The attacks were often fatal and went on for several days. Although the unsanctioned attacks were assumed to correspond with the call for independence, history tells us that violence would only result in more violence, and that at an even greater scale. This was the case in the East Wing. The Yahya Khan-led government launched Operation Searchlight on the 26th of March 1971, which allegedly was an attempt at suppressing the secessionist movements in the East and preserving the unity of Pakistan. But this was only a facade. The truth Pakistan held back from the world was its intention to eliminate all Bengali opposition, be it military, political, or intellectual, thereby crushing Bengali nationalism. Operation Searchlight was a conspiracy to eliminate all Hindus in East Pakistan, a fact which was unwittingly exposed by West Pakistani soldiers who claimed they were ordered to deal with the Hindu problem in East Pakistan. The operation resulted in the Bangladesh genocide, in which about 3 million lives were lost and hundreds of thousands of Bangladeshi people were abused. The Bengalis put up a fierce resistance, often ambushing the Pakistani military convoys. However, they lacked trained manpower and logistics that were vital in securing their territory. The Pakistani troops crushed all major cities and towns, and what remained of the Bengali guerrilla fighters were driven across the border into India. That also includes 10 million displaced Bengalis who fled to India. The Pakistani army also destroyed banknotes and coins, and East Pakistan suffered a severe shortage of ready cash. Fueled by the magnitude of destruction done to East Pakistan, West Pakistani soldiers launched a failed attack on 11 air stations owned by the Indian military, sparking the Third Indo-Pakistani War. Pakistan quickly realized it was a battle they could not win and surrendered after 2 weeks, granting East Pakistan its hard-won independence. East Pakistan was renamed Bangladesh, and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was appointed the country's first prime minister. When Sheikh Mujib was sworn in as Prime Minister, he introduced 4 core principles that defined his leadership style: democracy, socialism, nationalism, and secularism, which came to be known as Mujibism. Under Mujib's social government, the state nationalized around 86% of the country's industrial assets, which included 72 textile factories, 17 sugar mills, 3 paper mills, 4 major gas fields, and 70 jute mills. The state also imposed a limit on land ownership, domestic and foreign private investments, and salary. The stock market was temporarily shut down, and all financial institutions, including the country's top banks, were nationalized. Mujib's government supervised the 1973 general elections, which of course he won with a landslide victory, and became the first president of Bangladesh. Although Mujib had the interest of his countrymen at heart, his government was however plagued with corruption and nepotism. A background search on Sheikh Mujib's top government officials revealed they were his close associates and members of his own family. But despite the conclave he built around himself, Mujib's government lacked trained personnel, was inefficient, and his leadership style was unsatisfactory. Critics say his decision to build a socialist economy lacked a clear vision, which resulted in the inefficient management of the state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. As of 1991, the losses incurred by the mismanagement of state-owned enterprises cost Bangladesh about 1% of its GDP. Also, Mujib's plan to secularize the country was greatly criticized, particularly by Islamic fundamentalists. Soon enough, he found himself trying to pacify the Islamic wing of the country by reviving the Islamic Academy, which had been defunct since 1972, and banning alcoholic drinks in line with the demands of the Islamic groups. President Mujib also tried to secure Bangladesh's membership in the Organization of Islamic Conference and the Islamic Development Bank. But these efforts, noble as they were, did little to curtail the political unrest and violence that characterized his government. Mujib, through a drastic move, increased his political powers by declaring himself president for life. He then declared a state of emergency and banned all opposition parties, stifling the country's hard-won democracy. He also created the Jatiyo Rakhi Bahini, or JRB, a government militia which hunted down his political opponents and carried out extrajudicial killings and disappearances. The JRB, created to maintain law and order, received overwhelming power from Mujib's government and became a nightmare to anyone who criticized President Mujib's strict leadership. In 1974, Bangladesh, still recovering from the ravaging impact of war, experienced a series of floods along the Brahmaputra River, which resulted in a disastrous famine. Mujiba's inexperienced government was not in any way prepared for this catastrophe. Over 1 million people were believed to have perished during the famine. Among them were poor wage laborers and non-landowners who were more susceptible to diseases. For a nation barely surviving on its agrarian economy, a loss of thousands of hectares of agricultural land was devastating. On August 15, 1975, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, his entire family and personal staff were killed in a bloody coup. The only survivors were Mujibur's daughters, Sheikh Hasina Wajed and Sheikh Rahana, who were studying in West Germany. They were exiled in absentia. 3 months later, General Ziaur Rahman staged the country's second military coup and assumed full control of the nation in 1977. Zia implemented liberal economic policies that gave root to the privatization of state-owned enterprises. A few Bengali-owned companies were returned to their owners. The creation of a disinvestment board saw over 200 state-owned enterprises being privatized between 1975 and 1981. Zia also reactivated the Dhaka Stock Exchange and then established the Bangladesh Investment Corporation to raise finance for the construction of bridges as well as underwriting facilities for the private sector. Zia's contributions were a step forward for the country's crawling economy. However, he abused his authority and oppressed the very soldiers who helped him get to power. In Bangladeshi history, no government, military or civilian, was as consistent with extrajudicial sentencing, disappearances, and killings as Zia's. As such, multiple attempts were made on his life. On May 30th, 1981, after surviving as many as 20 military coups, Zia was assassinated. The country's Prime Minister Abdus Sattar took over as interim head and swiftly organized the 1981 general elections, which of course he won and became the 7th president of Bangladesh. However, his government was terminated through a bloodless coup that installed Hussein Mohammad Ershad in power. Ershad wasn't the kind of leader Bangladeshis would look forward to remembering. However, denying the fact that his government made a strong impact on the economy of Bangladesh would be a major flaw. Interestingly, Ershad's government had nothing new to offer, but only followed through with the economic policies of Ziaur Rahman's regime. After stabilizing the Bangladesh Armed Forces, which had been divided by coups and counter-coups, Ershad cooperated with the IMF by ensuring several state-owned enterprises were transferred to private individuals. Also, Ershad opened up the country to foreign aid and investment by signing a policy that fostered private and foreign investment in labor-intensive, high-tech, and export-oriented industries. An export processing zone established in 1980, but that had remained inactive since then, began functioning under Ershad's government. These policies offered a competitive advantage to the economy and laid the groundwork for the impressive economic growth Bangladesh would experience in the coming years. By promulgating the construction of the Jamuna Bridge in 1985, Ershad connected the country's north and south, promoting a greater ease of trade between both regions. In addition, Ershad signed a promulgation that required the mobilization of domestic resources by placing a levy on the Jamuna Bridge. About 5.08 billion Bangladesh takas were mobilized by the state before the declaration was terminated. Ershad's greatest achievement was the establishment of local governments by creating upazilas in place of larger districts, each having its own elected council and operating within its constituted authority. However, Ershad had the longest autocratic rule in Bangladesh, and a series of strikes and demonstrations forced his resignation and incarceration in the early 90s. While Bangladesh was caught in the thick of political turmoil, several non-government organizations worked laboriously to ensure the country wasn't overwhelmed by its challenges, and also to improve its living conditions. In the wake of the 1974 famine, a government research project was conducted by Muhammad Yunus about how to design a credit delivery system to provide non-collateral loans to poor and landless rural families. The aim was to provide a small startup capital of $27 to $65 to start micro businesses and reduce rural poverty in Bangladesh. Prior to this, rural Bangladesh wasn't accustomed to formal lending institutions. The loans were non-collateral and collective rural businesses could access capital to invest in rice and oil mills, tube wells, and/or to lease land for joint cultivation. This microcredit system was established as the Grameen Bank in 1983. In about a decade, the Grameen had provided loans to about 200,000 rural households, with records showing that over 80% of these credit loans were received by women, which was part of the original plan. Research findings revealed that lending to women could generate secondary effects, such as the empowerment of a marginalized segment of society who will share the income benefits with their children. The most amazing thing was, despite Bangladesh's history of defaulting loans, the Grameen Bank saw a phenomenal recovery of over 95% of its loans. Indeed, recognizing the role of women in a least developed society as Bangladesh was a game changer. In recent times, the Bangladesh Bank has encouraged all banks and non-financial institutions to grant loans to female business owners at a reduced interest rate, preferably 9%. That is in addition to setting up a dedicated women entrepreneur desk and sanctioning collateral-free loans up to the tune of 2.5 million Bangladesh takas to women entrepreneurs. In 2017, about 19,000 women-led businesses were refinanced, with at least 20 billion Bangladesh takas. In the mid-70s, the Bangladesh Rehabilitation Assistance Committee, BRAC, a non-government organization established by Fazil Hassan Abed in 1972, was committed to assisting the landless, small farmers, artisans, and vulnerable women through vocational training and building community centers. BRAC made the most impact in curtailing the outbreak of diarrhea that had been rampant since the 1974 flooding. It started a field operation that taught rural mothers how to prepare an oral rehydration solution from available resources and how to use it to treat diarrhea. In just 10 years, BRAC educated about 12 million families across 75,000 Bangladesh villages. The operation was highly effective in curbing the child mortality rate caused by diarrhea. As such, 15 years after the training program, rural women continued using the ORS as an effective way to combat severe cases of diarrhea. BRAC remains one of the largest NGOs in the world and is present in 16 other countries aside from Bangladesh. From being a country with nearly 50% of its GDP coming from the agricultural sector alone, Bangladeshis have in recent years achieved industrial prominence. In the late 70s, Asian entrepreneurs and managers, frustrated by the high quotas they had to pay importing to nations like the United States, set up their own enterprises in Bangladesh. For one, the cost of labor in Bangladesh was relatively cheap compared to their home country. Surprisingly, products made in Bangladesh turned out pretty well, meeting the standards of customers in North America and Western Europe. This new business, which involved the production and exportation of ready-made garments, also called RMG, was an instant goldmine, with businesses recovering their startup capital in less than 12 months. In the twinkling of an eye, Bangladesh became the 6th largest supplier to the North American market, having 85% of its total output sold to North American customers. The insane growth of the RMG market encouraged Bangladeshi capitalists to start companies in major towns where ready-made garments such as cotton shirts for men and boys, women's and girls' blouses, shorts, and baby clothes were produced and shipped to customers overseas. In its first 10 years, the RMG market generated only $3 million in export receipts, but a few years after that, export revenue rose to $32 million. A year later, exports impressively peaked at $116 million. In 1985, the RMG market had peaked so high, about 400 firms were committed to garment making, having around 200,000 workers, 80% of them being women. By 1986, ready-made garments brought in the second largest export revenue to the economy. Although the US and a few other industrial nations were threatened by the flood of affordable yet durable made-in-Bangladesh garments in their markets and imposed quotas in each category of Bangladeshi garments, Bangladeshi manufacturers adapted to the system and kept diversifying their products to categories without quotas. A few companies packed up and laid off their workers, but the more established companies survived, and export revenue peaked at $131 million. Aside from the success of ready-made garments, Bangladesh also became a major exporter of seafood, such as shrimp, frog legs, and fish in the 80s. A decade before that, frozen seafood was responsible for less than 1% of the country's GDP, with a yearly revenue of $3.4 million. It rose to $40 million in 1981, and then $113 million in 1986. In the mid-80s, shrimps, either fresh or frozen, accounted for 2/3 of seafood exports in Bangladesh. The country also has an abundance of natural resources, pivotal in growing the fisheries sector, including the potential to develop inland bodies of water. About 80% of proteins in Bangladeshi food come from fish. Commercial fishermen were usually low-caste Hindus who worked under harsh conditions, using primitive yet dexterous methods of fishing. The more exposed ones used domesticated otters, which drive the fishes towards the fisherman's net. Japan, Belgium, the United States, and Britain are major buyers of Bangladeshi seafood. Bangladesh was once the world's largest producer of jute, a substance used in making mats, rope and twine, carpet backing, burlaps, and sacks. Jute was the highest export earner in Bangladesh. However, unstable prices and the competitive rise of synthetic alternatives have affected the Bangladesh jute market. Presently, Bangladesh is the second largest producer of jute, housing over 220 private jute mills. Bangladesh also played a role in the global leather trade, although minor. Due to the country's high-quality skins and premium prices, it generated a revenue of between $56 and $90 million. However, leather trade had little potential for growth, primarily because the country's unequal land distribution and competition for feed affected the population of goats and cattle. Studies show that in the 1980s, about 25 to 50% of land in the countryside was owned by the richest 10% of the population, while the bottom 60% controlled only 25% of land. One of the many problems of Bangladesh had also been its negative trade balance, which was a normal occurrence since independence. The government used its export revenue to sort out around 30% of its imports, but it didn't do much in rescuing the economy from having a trade deficit. Perhaps the country's biggest decision during this difficult time was exporting workers to wealthy Islamic countries such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq. In 1986, the total amount of remittance sent into the country by these workers accounted for 23% of import costs and also became one of the country's biggest sources of foreign exchange. With over 75,000 recruits working overseas, $575 million have been sent to Bangladesh. Also, educated Bangladeshis who are well advanced in their careers and have relocated to Britain, the US, or Canada remit their savings to their relatives in Bangladesh, based on government incentives and the promise of a preferential exchange rate. However, despite the staggering amount of remittance coming into Bangladesh yearly, the country still couldn't overcome its deficit problem. In the 1980s, for instance, deficit ranged from $1.5 billion to $1.8 billion. During this period, foreign aid played a messianic role in ensuring the country didn't experience a shortage of foreign exchange. It's no news that top economists and policymakers once regarded Bangladesh as a test case for development, and the extreme case of population growth far outstripping resources. Given this horrible profiling, the World Bank undertook the challenge of championing foreign aid campaigns in Bangladesh since the country's independence. Under the guidance of the World Bank, the Bangladesh Aid Group, comprising 26 governments and institutions, was formed. In its first year, the group made a financial commitment of $551 million, which then rose to $1.2 billion the following year. Financial aid then peaked at an all-time high of $1.9 billion in the late 1980s. The World Bank has shown genuine interest in ensuring Bangladesh's economic constraints are eliminated by promoting equal economic opportunities for women, providing employment to the landless, and addressing the country's health, nutrition, and population challenges. The World Bank channeled its loans through the International Development Association, and these loans were collateral-free, with a grace period of 10 years before repayment began. Alongside the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank was also another major donor to Bangladesh, with half their loans going to agriculture and the agro-industry. In 1985, 66 loans totaling $1.8 billion were approved by the Asian Development Bank, and part of the package included a livestock development project intended to increase food production and also improve the income of rural families by expanding veterinary services and livestock nutrition. Also, in partnership with the Norwegian government, the Asian Development Bank approved a grant aimed at exploring the feasibility of growing rubber trees for commercial purposes in Bangladesh. Now, alongside its agricultural interest in Bangladesh, the Asian Development Bank also approved a loan of $74 million intended to cover 71% of the costs for construction and extension of natural gas transmission and distribution pipelines to 5 districts in eastern Bangladesh. The United States was also a major donor to independent Bangladesh. US aid focused on 3 areas: improved soil fertility, food security, and increased off-farm employment. As of September 1987, US aid amounted to $2.8 billion. Alongside the US were Japan, Britain, and West Germany, who initiated aid programs of their own. From the mid-90s, Bangladesh began experiencing multiple breakout signs economically, resulting in a steady GDP growth. Fast forward to the 2000s, from an embarrassingly small GDP of $5.7 billion in 1972 to a GDP of $286 billion in 2018, with prospects of generating a GDP of $1.6 trillion in 2037. Bangladesh has indeed come a long way. Right now, its economy is the 31st largest in the world in terms of purchasing power parity, and the country's recent economic miracle has seen it graduate from a least developed country to a lower middle income country. Also, the country's per capita income peaked at $2,064 in 2020, a far cry from a per capita income of $134 in 1971. Looking back at how Pakistan had dominated Bangladesh in the 70s and proved to be more promising, Bangladesh has truly surprised the entire world. As of May 2021, its foreign exchange reserve reached an all-time high of $45 billion, while Pakistan's reserve was just $27 billion. In just 30 years, Bangladesh has witnessed a reduction in its poverty rate from 57% in 1991 to 22% in recent times. The country's population challenges weren't left out in this miracle. Way back in the 60s, Bangladeshi women gave birth to as many as 7 children. But with the advent of family planning initiatives and women's enlightenment programs, Bangladesh has recorded a modest birth rate of 2 children per woman, as well as a sharp decrease in child mortality rate. Even better, life expectancy has increased from 46 years during the country's first decade to 72.5 years in recent times. Female literacy in Bangladesh leaped to 72%, while India follows behind at 66% and Pakistan is slightly below average at 46%. Since the tragic cyclone Bola in 1974, Bangladesh has shown resilience in combating climate disasters. From being one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, Bangladesh has reduced cyclone-related deaths by 100-fold. This is truly amazing. Bangladesh has shown how a country can combat climate challenges with a minuscule budget. The country's secret formula lies in involving the community in its cyclone preparedness programs. Presently, Bangladesh has over 76,000 trained volunteers ready to manage the severity of climate disasters. In 1974, Bangladesh could afford just a few climate-resilient shelters, but in recent times, over 5,000 climate-resilient houses have been built, which can house over 5 million people. Bangladesh also unveiled Vision 2041, which focuses heavily on digitalization, particularly in the agricultural sector. By using IoT devices and drone tech, Bangladeshi farmers will be equipped with the data needed to protect and maximize their crop yields, even during unstable seasons. By all accounts, Bangladesh has experienced immense economic growth, which is by no means accidental. Bangladesh has risen from being an economic basket case, the largest poorest country, a test case for development, to becoming a fast-rising South Asian tiger. Undoubtedly, the country still has its own demons, but with its recent economic surprise, Bangladesh has shown it can withstand any challenge thrown its way.